Budget after budget, year after year, one thing never changes: the obsession over the fiscal deficit. On paper, it's very simple, just the difference between the government's revenue and expenditure. In reality, it is the barometer to judge the prudence and performance of the Indian economy, a yardstick for every finance minister on which his union budget is actually judged on.
Many believe Finance Minister JT fell for the trap laid out by his predecessor, who set a very stiff target. But what should he do now? Throw caution to the wind and let the fisc expand in his pursuit of the non-negotiable growth? Or should he not even think about breaching the Lakshman Rekha? Is fiscal deficit much ado about nothing after all? That's precisely what we're debating on the show. And joining us are some of the finest economists of this country: Swaminathan Aiyar Mythili Bhusnurmath, Dr. Rajiv, Kumar and Sajjid Chinoy, all joining in live for this special debate. Mythili, I want to start with you. We met the target last year. We're going to meet the target this year as well. It's a certainty going into the budget. But the bigger question is, how are we meeting these targets? Isn't that more important than meeting the target in itself?
Oh, absolutely, Sandeep. I think how you achieve the target, whether it's by crunching or capital expenditure, whether it is, the bigger attention actually should be paid to the revenue deficit. Unfortunately, in the entire discussion about fiscal deficit, that is completely lost sight of. So it is not really the size of the fiscal deficit per se that matters. It is the quality of the fiscal deficit. Are you borrowed money for your current expenditure, or are you using borrowed money, in fact, to invest? So that is very critical. At the same time, I think, as Supriya mentioned, the obsession with the fiscal deficit, it is an obsession. Because frankly, if you are going to fudge your numbers and get this very wonderful figure like the previous government did, and unfortunately Mr. Jaitley fell for that trap, as you said, because last year was an opportunity for him to blame the previous government for all the jugglery that they had done, the financial engineering that they had done, the way they rolled over the expenses. Unfortunately, he missed that great opportunity. Today it's going to be very difficult for him to pass the blame to the previous government. So certainly what he should say is that, yes, look, when the economy is contracting, and there's not contracting really, they're not growing too well, and private investment is not happening, banks are not lending, the public sector must step into the breach. Because when public sector steps into the breach in the right way, by investing in the right things, private sector investment will come crowding in, and then you'll have growth, and then your revenues, and then the fiscal deficit can be taken care of. Again, I repeat, it's not the fiscal deficit, but the revenue deficit that should be in focus.
Fair point indeed. But Swami, I know you don't agree with that thesis. I know you're not a believer that the Lakshman Rekha should be crossed, as it were. But isn't there argument in the points that Mythili made that, you can have a great fiscal deficit number, you can arrive at it to the last decimal point, but it's about how you do it?
Anybody who says we are obsessed, excuse me, you've broken every single target that you have ever had if you go back to the original FRBM thing. So to claim we are obsessed is obviously wrong. More correctly, we constantly forget about it, and then at the last minute you do some little fudging. To call this an obsession is not to understand what the word obsessed means. In other words, we don't actually give a damn for this, but we try to do some cosmetics at the end of it to somehow pretend that we are being prudent or that we know what we are doing. Now, the fiscal deficit that we have, the center and states put together, when you get to the 6.5, these are gargantuan by international standards. I find that whenever we discuss the fiscal deficit, we are never discussing it in terms of what are the norms, because when you are addressing a global audience, you have to say, how do we stack up against the others? I remember when Argentina went bust in 1998, I asked somebody what happened. They said, their fiscal deficit exceeded 4% of GDP. And ours was about double that much. So, the fiscal deficits we run are gargantuan by global standards. So if you want to make a particular impact, either you have to say, I'm fantastic, I spend my money so extremely well that in my case, my fiscal deficit is just fine. But I'm sorry, as Mythili has pointed out, the quality of our fiscal deficit is terrible. So if the quality of our fiscal deficits is terrible and they are large, there's no point pretending that, the foreigners are obsessed with this. The foreigners will say, look, if you borrowed less and spent it better, surely you will be better off. Money does not fall from the heavens. There is no money the government has that does not belong to somebody else and could not have been used by somebody else better than the government. So as I say, this is what Frederick Bastiat said, the difference between what is seen and what is not seen. You see the government investing and say, how good? The answer is, suppose the government hadn't invested, wouldn't the private sector invested the same amount and maybe somewhat better?
Right.
So I will simply say, The important part of the fiscal deficit is not just a budget figure. It's a question of, are you managing the resources of a country properly? If you are seen to be doing that properly, I think foreign worries about your deficit will disappear. When it's very clear that that is not the thrust of your thing, I think foreigners have every right to be somewhat worried about it.
All right, let's get in Dr. Rajiv, Kumar and Sajjid Chinoy as well into the debate. Dr. Kumar, what side of the debate are you in? Do you agree with Mythili that what's more important is the quality of fiscal consolidation? We shouldn't obsess about the number. We shouldn't obsess so much about the size given the state of the economy right now?
Fiscal discipline to me means that revenue deficit should be brought down to zero. You cannot spend more than what you earn on your current expenditure. That's just simple fiscal profligacy which will not work. But although Swami has given us a lesson in English grammar about whether it is obsession or not, the fact is that we are so much always talking about this figure called fiscal deficit, which has come to us from some European sort of discussions, etc. And this 3% number that has been brought up off and on is just a number plugged out of from the Maastricht Treaty in the European context, which they have often breached themselves. The third point that I would like to make is that, as Swami mentioned, that this is Garaguntum on this huge 6% if you take center and state together. I think Swami forgets that the fiscal deficit is calculated on a GDP which is probably 40% lower than the actual GDP of this economy if you include the black economy, the parallel economy. So if you bring that in, the fiscal deficit number, the amount that government is borrowing, is probably much less than what the numbers actually indicate. And finally, I have to say that if the private sector is not spending, is not investing, it has always got the option of taking the money out of the country, which it has been doing in the last couple of years. So therefore, for the government to just wait on its hands for private investment to come in and to re-trigger, to start the growth cycle would be just, I think, complete sort of inertia.
Fair point indeed. I'm tempted to go back to Swami and get a retort, but I'll go back to Sajjid Chinoy and get him into this debate. Sajjid, would you worry too much if that 4.1% was 4.3, if that 3.6 was 3.8, instead of the fact if planned expenditure wasn't cut, if excise duty hikes didn't happen at the pace at which is, because this is not sustainable. These are not things that can happen in perpetuity.
True. So let's not quibble about small numbers. Nobody's going to mind if 3.6 becomes 3.8. But let's look at today's situation in more historical and comparative perspective. I completely agree with Swami. If you just look at India's sovereign ratings peers, let's not pick advanced economies. Let's pick the countries that have the same sovereign rating as us. India's consolidated deficit, even after 2 years of fiscal consolidation, is 6.5% at the very minimum. If you add contingent liabilities, it's closer to 8%. Do you know what our sovereign rating peer deficit is? It's 2.5% of GDP. Look at debt to GDP. Our debt to GDP is at 70%. What's our peer group with the same sovereign rating? It's 39%. So the starting point is one where you've got this very large aggregate deficit which has opportunity costs. Just go back 4 years. After the Lehman crisis, our fiscal deficit went from 2.6% of GDP to 6.5% of GDP. What happened in those years? You had inflation blowout, core inflation, non-food, non-fuel inflation went from 4.5% to 11% in those 4 years. You had the current account deficit blowout. So when you start with a very large level of a deficit and you talk about expanding it, the macroeconomic distortions can multiply very quickly. I'll make one final point. I don't think we have to choose between quantity and quality. I have said repeatedly over the last month, what the government should be doing is looking at its balance sheet much more holistically and doing an asset swap. We certainly need more public infrastructure from the budget, given that the PPP model has broken down. But how do you pay for that public infrastructure? You don't pay by borrowing more from the private sector and making it harder for them to invest. You sell the assets that you already own. The government's got lots of assets, stake in PSUs, land, spectrum, SUTI, if you were to have a programmatic plan to sell those assets and still retain your share well above 51%, you can do both things. You can stick to your fiscal deficit path over the next 2 or 3 years, and you can garner these non-tax revenues to pay for public infrastructure. You know, the first rule of corporate finance is you want to swap unproductive assets like current holdings into more productive roads, bridges, highways.
Sajjid says there is no real trade-off here, but the fact is that, you know, some of these asset sales, these are options that several other governments had. It is tough to exercise. Even on spectrum sale, there is a bit of a question mark as well. So is it being too simplistic to assume that you can actually manage the size of the deficit and also look at the quality of the fiscal deficit?
I have a slight difference of view from Sajjid, because actually asset sales are means of bridging the deficit. It is not a revenue in that sense. You should not really take it as part of your receipts, and most countries in fact don't. So the fiscal deficit is the difference between your expenditure and your revenue receipts plus your non-debt capital receipts. So frankly, the money that you get, the proceeds that you get from disinvestment are a means of bridging the deficit. So a slight increase in the deficit from 4.1 to 4.3, 4.4 is not a big deal. And Sajjid quoted some numbers, but actually if you look at the period from 2003 to 2008, that 5-year period when the average growth was 8.8, that time the combined fiscal deficit of the country was 6.7%. So it's not just necessarily a one-to-one relationship, and the fact is that if by increasing your fiscal deficit slightly, of course also with a view to improving your quality, provided you make that structural shift within the fiscal deficit towards investment and maybe ease your fiscal deficit just a little bit. I'm not talking about 6%, but maybe 4.2, 4.3 at a time when the rest of the economy is slowing down. I think the returns that you'll get in terms of higher growth and hence higher revenues will be worth taking that small risk. One shouldn't get too fixated on a particular number.
Fair point indeed. But Swami, just to take the thread of the conversation forward, the fact that Sajjid mentioned some of these things which he believes should have been done by the government, and Mythili says these are not sustainable, can't be done in perpetuity. The fact was that this was the government's best option to go and sell stake that it holds in companies, to go and do big ticket divestment that it actually did not, to go and sell spectrum. We're going to sell spectrum but with an artificially induced scarcity. We haven't done enough divestment that we could, given how robust the capital markets were. Has Mr. Jaitley missed the bus on some of these things where revenue could have come in for and he wouldn't have had to cut plan expenditure as much as he had to?
No, I mean, certainly it's been a mistake that I find finance ministers keep doing, that the divestment keeps getting pushed off and off almost till the last 1 month or 2 months of the financial year. And this strikes me just as incompetence. There is absolutely no reason why it should take so long that at the end of the year you're running around in circles desperately trying to sell whatever you can, and then you find there's some court stay order or some other problem and say, oh my God, what am I going to do? So this is incompetence. But yes, if you are serious and you start selling from the very first month of the next financial year, I see no difficulty that you should be able to do a very significant amount of asset swap, exactly as Sajjid Chinoy is suggesting. I mean, I've been saying the same thing myself. It's such an obvious thing to do. I mean, it is not necessary. Between the choice of funding a thing by additional borrowing and asset sales, I would do it through asset sales. I mean, Mythili is right in saying it doesn't reduce the fiscal deficit, but it is a better way of financing whatever you've got.
It's very clear at this stage in the debate that we've got Dr. Kumar and Mythili who believe there is a case to focus more on the quality of the fiscal deficit and give growth a chance, whereas Swami and Sajjid Chinoy both believe that we need to be more focused on fiscal consolidation. Great time to take a break, but we're going to be back with the debate and discuss lots more on the other side. Keep it with ET now.
Great to be back with you once again on budget debate, and as things were really hotting up, we had to take that break. But let's take up a new thread in this debate and take it to Dr. Rajiv Kumar. Sir, if I may begin by asking you on this very crucial question. Ratings agencies are very hawkishly watching on the fiscal deficit figure. The fact is that India's sovereign rating is one above junk. Can we afford to breach that figure, or do you believe the government can at all convince ratings agencies that this is being done in a bid to boost growth?
You know, this rating agency, the rating that India has, one above junk, is not all about fiscal deficit at all. Because what the credit rating agencies look at is your ability to service that debt. And at 79% of debt to GDP ratio, and our servicing ratios being quite comfortable to our revenue, I don't think the rating agencies are too bothered about our debt figure. if the rating agencies would be quite happy, for example, if this budget included a number of steps which will improve the supply side scenario by removing away all the impediments and making India a better place to invest, getting India to move from 142, the rank 142 in ease of doing business, to higher ranks. If they were going to remove, the other sort of constraints on, the procedural, the red tapes, the 70 clearances that our businesses have. So rating agencies are looking for how is the country, how is the economy doing, and what is the prospect like, and how will that affect its debt service ability. So therefore, this link that very often is made between the size of the fiscal deficit and the sword of credit rating agencies hanging on top of us, I think is as spurious as the correlation which is often being made between the inflation, as my friend Sajjid wants to make, between inflation and the size of the fiscal deficit. There are much better correlation that you will get between inflation and the revenue deficit, and between inflation and the supply side shortages. So my take is that if you can improve your fiscal, if you can improve the quality of your public expenditure, and that there is no assumption here that all government must fail, except that Swami is saying that he is cynical enough not to believe that. If we can improve the efficiency of our public expenditure, then clearly public expenditure has a crowding in effect and can trigger growth, which will make the credit rating agencies happier rather than make them come down on us and lower our credit rating agencies, right. our ratings.
Right. I can see Mythili nodding in agreement, but Sajjid, to you then, do we risk losing our credibility if we miss the fiscal targets? If we see a lot of fiscal slippage, is our credibility going to be lost as well?
It will be, right? I mean, just think of what the problem was. How did we reach a point in September 2012 where the current account had blown from 2% to 5%, inflation was raging high, and by all accounts, ratings agencies had put us on a very high level of warning when Mr. Chidambaram began what was difficult, painful, but very important fiscal consolidation. The genesis of all of these problems began in 2008-9 when policymakers kind of misread the situation and the fiscal deficit expanded from 2.5% to 6.5%. Growth was running above 7% and there was no fiscal consolidation. And I agree with Dr. Kumar about the quality of consolidation, but frankly, capital investment has got stuck at 1% of GDP for the last 4 or 5 years. So there is a one-to-one correlation here between the fiscal going up and therefore the revenue deficit going up, and that affecting aggregate demand and inflation. It's no coincidence that core inflation, non-food, non-fuel, which was 4.5% between 2003 and 2008, was running at 9 and 10 and 11% when your revenue deficit and your fiscal deficit was at 6.5%. So, there are very real macroeconomic consequences. I think our fiscal credibility has been earned over the last 2 years by both governments by making painful decisions. And why lose that credibility in a very turbulent global environment? If the Fed were to start raising rates and there are other global shocks, India is the darling among emerging markets. Why do we want to place question marks on that impression by moving the deficit by 0.1 or 0.2% of GDP?
Suppose Jaitley had not yet presented his first budget. I think there could have been a case for saying, let us change the fiscal deficit targets. Once he has presented his first budget and set targets, not to stick to those targets at this point would be fatal. It means that you don't take yourself seriously. If you don't take yourself seriously, why should others take you seriously?
But politics, Swami, who takes anybody in politics?
Lots of people do, believe me.
Okay, carry on then. Making a point.
We're talking about credibility. Whose credibility is at stake? Is it the credibility of India or the rating agencies? Look at the kind of ratings they gave. Southeast Asian crisis, the financial crisis. USA retained that AAA rating despite the fact that their budget deficit was over 10%. And what did they do when S&P dared to lower the US rating? Promptly they kind of said, took action against it, saying that your subprime ratings, you didn't do it properly. Why only S&P? Why not Moody's? So clearly there is much more than pure numbers that go into the rating. Having said that, it is not an argument for complete fiscal profligacy. Yes, you need to be careful in your own interest, not because you're bothered about the rating agencies. And to assume that rating agencies are bigger fools than they seem to be, just because you have a number of 4.1 and you've rolled over expenses, you haven't booked your expenses, surely they see through all that. So what is more important, to have integrity in your numbers and show up 4.5, but all expenses taken, or 4.1 on paper and lots of expenses under the carpet? I think one is, I agree rating agencies have got egg on their face, but surely they're not as stupid as they would appear to be.
Right. Dr. Kumar, but just to pick the point that Swami made, which is that, in many ways, Arun Jaitley's probably lost the opportunity. If at all he had to do this, he should have done it in the interim budget. That was probably the best time for him, and even Mythili made this point, that was probably the best time for him to say, look, there's been a lot of fiscal fudging, I'm going to set the record straight once and for all. Has he lost that opportunity?
Well, he's probably lost one opportunity, but that doesn't mean that he's missed the bus. He could have blamed it all, and he could have cleaned the slate. He could have just come up with real numbers and shown that the fiscal deficit in real terms, as Mythili has been saying, is much higher than what these cooked up numbers believe. But, well, he stuck his neck out because I think as he was advised by the officials whom he had inherited, and he said he'll go to 4.1 this year. But that does not in any case mean that he should also follow the same glide path that Chidambaram had set, which is 3.6 next year and then 3.0 the year after. He can give himself more fiscal space, more degrees of freedom by saying, yes, I'll stick to 4.1, and which he probably will in this year, in FY15. In the next budget, he will show that 14-15 the fiscal deficit is 4.1, because he's cut expenditure savagely in the last quarter. He will do that, and that will restore his credibility. Having done that, he should say, if I need to increase my expenditure because the private investment is not coming forth, because I have to trigger growth, I reserve the right to do so by the following means, and that will be quite acceptable.
I'll have to take this discussion away from Finance Minister Jaitley and the ratings agencies to the man who's watching it very closely, and that's Governor Raghuram Rajan. Swami, if I may ask you, because this fiscal deficit target for next year will actually have an impact on the rate cycle. What do you think the impact will be? Will Raghuram Rajan also be watching for that fiscal deficit number, or will he be watching the quality of fiscal consolidation?
I think he's going to be watching both, but above all, he's going to be scratching his head on the revision of the CSO data. Because, here is this man who's been saying, the time is getting ripe to bring interest rates down. And suddenly you're told that you did 8.3% growth, which is way above your potential output. So it's an overheating economy where perhaps you have to increase interest rates to 12%. So I think he has to worry about that. He has sent out a clear signal that he is going to take the fiscal thing seriously. Within that, I think he will take seriously certainly the fiscal deficit number, as well as some adjustment for quality, whatever he wants to make. Certainly, he's not going to be completely fooled on this particular aspect. So, I think on that, the Jaitley and Raghuram Rajan are seeing eye to eye, that we are going to have fiscal consolidation, and this is then going to pave the way for interest rates to come down. The big spoiler, I'm afraid, has become the CSO data, which make a nonsense of any kind of decent analysis, because it transforms India from a tortoise into a hare.
No, I think in fact Raghuram Rajan is going to get slightly cockeyed, because he'll have to keep one eye on Jaitley and one eye on Janet Yellen. And given the fact that one is here and one is in the US, I think he's going to have a tough time keeping his eyes focused on any one thing.
Completely running out of time. I want to get closing comments then from Dr. Kumar and Sajjid Chinoy as well. Sajjid, to you first. It's very clear which side of the debate you are in, but more importantly, what do you see the finance minister doing, given the track record that we've seen so far and the kind of expectation that's being built into the market? What do you see him doing?
So, I agree with everyone. I just don't think there's as much of a trade-off between fiscal consolidation and public expenditure that is being made out to be. I think given the collapse in oil prices, this is a unique opportunity for this government to achieve both.
Final word from Dr. Rajiv Kumar. Mr. Jaitley is a very astute political animal as well. Besides being a cautious finance minister, we've discussed what he should do. What do you think he will do, Dr. Kumar?
I think he will stick to the 4.1 GDP target for this year. Two, I think he will give himself more fiscal space by, saying that, look, the 3.6 and the earlier targets are not really cast in stone, and he will see how the economy grows. Third, I think he will please Dr. Raghuram Rajan by taking some solid supply side measures which will improve the doing business climate and the investment climate in the country. And fourth, I think what he will do is to improve our tax structure very much, because by doing that he will make sure that the direct tax to GDP ratio rises. He gets more in his revenue, so that he gives himself more fiscal space. What he should be doing, just one last should, is that he should be saying that there are some very completely dead assets in the government's kitty which he should be monetizing, and I hope he will do that, because if he does, then he gets more room for greater public investment, which is, I think, to my mind, the key is to get higher public investment in the economy so that the growth cycle takes off today, notwithstanding whatever the CSO has been saying.
Completely out of time here on this edition of the Budget Debate. It was a divided house, absolutely on the fifth. Much ado about nothing. Well, the panel does think so.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.